everybody. You're listening to the Currency of Discourse with myself, Quade, Chris, and then co-host 2 again. And today we're going to be talking about Job, but just briefly, I want to mention if you go to the description section, those are all the links for things. I'm sure you know what to do if you like or want to support a podcast, and that'll kind of be the end of that spiel. So we're just going to jump into Job here, and I think the point is just to kind of talk about how the story of Job has something to, I think, offer the common person, regardless of what your own religious beliefs are. There is, I think, like a deeper point that transcends religion, and I hope that's the type of conversation we have, but they might have different perspectives. The other two people sitting here, and we've all studied it in kind of possibly different ways and similar ways, and we'll see what kind of comes of that.
Should we give a brief overview of what happens in the story? Yeah.
Well, yeah, we can. I think one way that it can help, this is going to give my perspective on it already, though, which is kind of Slavoj Žižek's interpretation of Job, which I thought was really interesting because I was reading it like maybe a month and a half ago, and Slavoj Žižek's interpretation is that it's not a story about a relationship between Job and God. It's about the hardships of a person that happen for seemingly no or kind of arbitrary reasons. And so what he's going to say is that, and this is true, if you go read it, you know, if you don't know any of the story of Job, right? I mean, he pretty much loses everything, right? And we can talk about, by the way, this isn't, I'm sure if you are listening to this, your proclivities are probably going to be to talk about what sucks about Job, which is fine. I would be fine having a conversation with on any other day, but that's just not the point of this podcast right here. Some people might say, well, that, and actually you might even get into that, Jay. You might start to offer up that perspective.
What sucks about Job?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, Job is one of my favorite books of the Bible because it's the one that I spend more time thinking on than probably any other book. So I don't think the book sucks. The circumstances drive me mad trying to figure out what's going on in the story.
I based that off of another conversation we had where you basically said, like, basically it's not fair, like it's bullshit. That was kind of like the summation of your...
And Job himself talks about that in the book.
And there's already a cuss word already. So
who said that?
I did.
Oh.
Yeah.
Not getting any money from this one.
But so the point is that he loses everything he owns. He loses his family, and he is basically kind of like in a position where he's not healthy.
How did that come about, though?
Well, it came about because of a bet, right?
Between who?
Between Satan and God, right? So that's the idea. But Slavoj Žižek is going to say that the bet between Satan and God is the side matter. It's really not the fixed feature. And I would agree with him just from my perspective. It can be the main feature, and that's where you start to get into like, that's not fair. The bet was that that the only reason that Job was the faithful human that he was because of what he had and what God had given him, essentially, and that he wouldn't continue to do those things if they were taken away. I think, is that I mean, you maybe read it more recently than I did, but I think that's ballpark.
From Job's perspective or from Satan's perspective?
Just in the Bible. In the Bible, it starts with Satan and God, right? And God is kind of like touting
Satan
Job.
Appears in the same in God's presence.
Right.
God asks where he's been. He said, "I've been roaming to and fro the earth."
Mm-hmm.
And then I think, correct me if I'm wrong,
which
God...
is kind of funny. He's kind of like, where you put me?
Yeah.
Like, I'm sorry, that's funny.
and God, says something about Job. Well, have you seen the most righteous? Isn't that's what happens? He prompts a question about Job.
He's like, have you guys considered my servant Job? And and Satan's argument is basically like, look, the only reason he follows and worships you is because of all the stuff that you have,
Right.
or
So
that he has.
right.
If you strike him, if you take this away, then
It's not going to
then
be the same thing.
He won't worship you. And
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so that's the context of the first part. And so just to finish kind of like my dynamic on this, Slavoj Žižek comes along, or Slavoj Žižek is going to say that so Job loses everything because of this bet, right? So God allows Satan to kind of take these things away, and then his friends come up to him, and that's the interesting part to me. That's the part that I highlight in my head, which is they have all these explanations, and if you read the explanations, they're biblical explanations. That's the interesting part to me, that they're not saying anything that strays too far from earlier chapters in the Bible of certain behaviors of why things happen, and only in the end does God come by and say like they're all stupid, basically, for saying all those things.
He has 3 friends, and they come all from faraway places, and they, in one way or another, again, correct me if I'm wrong, they essentially tell him that these things wouldn't be happening to you if you weren't a sinner. If you hadn't committed sin against God.
Right, if you sacrificed more. They actually all have different explanations too, which is the interesting thing.
And Job is saying, I haven't sinned. I have been loyal to God. And he sticks with that. He holds to that.
Yeah, I think he does end up flip-flopping. He does a lot of lamenting to me. He's not necessarily saying, I didn't do anything wrong. He's more just like, I'm fucked up right now. Like, guys, bad shit's happening to me. Like, he just kind of is that over and over,
Which I've heard a commentary on that. And because, I mean, to be honest, just being perfectly honest, I never really liked the book. I never really, like, it's just one of those things I'm like, I'm not really wanting to go through this book. It's fascinating. You guys enjoy this book so much because I just never
I spend so much time on it.
I never got into it until I started to understand or start looking into the sovereignty of God and going past like a free will type of understanding of Christianity. And I think I talked about this the last time I was, or maybe the time before that I was on with the like predestination aspect of, and kind of like God, it kind of being like, did I do this for God or did God do this for me, it pertaining to salvation? And whenever I got to that particular point, and I started to look at things differently in the scripture, and it wasn't just a thing about, oh, God could possibly one day just take everything that I have, because I think that is the selfish motivation that arises, especially in like a new believer or a Christian is just like, oh, this sucks. You know what I'm saying? And I got to read about the fact that at any moment right now, God could just take anything away. But I think there are underlying perspectives that are highlighted all throughout the scriptures that actually point back to the sovereignty of God. And just an interesting thing too, like I've heard that it's even when in the New Testament, when Peter is where Jesus looks at Peter and he says to him, he says, Satan has desired to sift you as wheat. He says, but I pray for you that your faith may fail. And in that context of the scripture, I think some of the same language is used, alluding to what Satan did before God with Job, and it being something that was, yes, Satan has laid a petition for these things to happen, but it's my desire that is going to outweigh, or it's going to I'm going to allow him to do certain things. And we know Peter goes through this thing of cursing Jesus, or not cursing Jesus, but cursing out the little kid, denying him 3 times, and all these things happen. But they bring Peter to this place of, my righteousness is utterly insufficient for the righteousness that you would provide. And I think the argument that Satan had before God was actually correct. And you can see it even through some of the things that Job says. Like you were saying, he seems like he's more lamenting than he is. He says, there's one part where he says he wouldn't utter anything against God, right? But in other words, he's saying there are some things that I would have said.
Yeah.
But because he may take more things away from me, or because this may happen, it seems that I'm in a corner. I know he's God. I know he has complete authority over everything. But instead of really saying what is in my heart, and the fact that the underlying source of why I'm doing the things that I'm doing, like for instance, him taking and burning sacrifices for his children. Well, if you do anything in Christianity, that's not how it works. You know, God's like, I'm not a respecter of persons. It's righteousness that satisfies me. It's a righteous heart. I can't buy you into heaven. Mm-hmm. And that's essentially what Job is trying to do. He's saying, I'm going to give you this sacrifice, like he's paying God off for his children's bad behavior, mm-hmm. or possible bad behavior. Like, I'm going to cut this deal with God. And so it's this underlying self-righteousness that I don't even think Job was aware of. And for me, that story hit home because I grew up in church. And so, like, there was this dynamic that I had with God, where there's people that live these wild lives and things like that, and then came to Christ. And it's just like, they get up on Sunday morning, it was like, yeah, I was a cokehead, I did all this type of stuff. You know what I'm saying? I shot people, and I'm thinking, well, my little insignificant story doesn't matter. But the thing that struck me about this story is that God hates self-righteousness also. And it's a part of the lesson to Job, is that at the end he says, come gird up your loins like a man, and tell me where you were when I did this, when I did that. And in other words, there's a way that you see me that you think that you're adding something that is insufficient. And in my grace, I allowed these things to happen where I both shamed the desires of the enemy towards your life. Because at the end of the day, he was playing them like a fiddle. At the end of the day, you can't find righteousness except for by faith.
Well, Job gets the most epic chewing out of all mankind.
Yeah.
When God arrives in the tornado.
Yeah. And
shows him like these pre-cosmic creatures, like the behemoth and the Leviathan. But at the beginning of the book, what Job's wife says, you should just curse God and then he'll kill you. But he says, essentially, if I had to simplify it, he says you must take the good that God gives you with the bad. Yeah. So he acknowledges that like, I have to accept what's happening to me. Yeah. But he's frustrated because he doesn't feel like he deserves it. Right. He's done what he thinks he's supposed to do.
Yeah, and that's closer to what I take from it is and maybe the difference between the secular and the Christian perspective, because behavior is completely divorced from consequence for me. And that's the important part to me. The important part is that all of your truth and I've talked before about like God being this, I think God is, whether or not you believe that God is an actual being, I personally don't, or I don't think that God is a conscious being. I still think that God is a useful notion in that it can be a perspective for our ignorance and our moral actions. In that so the idea is that if I'm a truthful enough person, if I'm a moral enough person, then I'll get X, Y, and Z. And to me, the point of Job is, no, like, you are small. You are small in this universe. It's way bigger and more powerful than you. Your actions can't manifest everything in that huge universe. You don't have control over it. So stop worrying about that. And that goes into what you said, where he was like, I have to, or the idea of taking the good with the bad, right? You'll take God's blessings, but you won't take the curses. And that's kind of the point for me, is to stop focusing on the consequences of your life so much. Like, they happen, and I'm not saying it's just, I'm not saying it's right, but it happens. And to focus more on that, I think you're better off. I think you're going to be in a place now where you're better off, you're more ready to act and do the things that you need to be doing anyway, because you aren't spending so much time thinking about and lamenting, which is exactly what Job is doing. Why is this happening to me? And woe is me, right? It's just like, Something bad happens. Oh, that's right. I'm in the universe. This happens. This is something that's going to continue to happen until the day that I die. So let me just get past it now and continue to do what I have to do to try to survive and make it. It's not fair, but
we don't know if Job was actually like following a Jewish like belief system or not. I mean, he came from the land of Uz, so we don't know if he's following the same kind of faith that.
But it does say that the Bible does call him righteous, though, right?
Yeah, but
it
you
does
don't have
specifically.
to be. You don't have to be Jewish to be close to God.
Huh.
Even back then, I mean, you could still have
That
been
is
a
something I
righteous
did not know.
person. But regardless of that, so my caveat to that is that if he was or wasn't, he was still thinking, or at least from a Jewish tradition, God was loyal to you based on how you served him. And so if you were righteous, it should follow that your life will be good.
Right.
And if you're not righteous, bad things could happen to you.
Right.
So it's justified for him to be confused. I mean, if I'm interpreting things right, it's justified. He's justified in being confused as to what's happening to him based on what he understands of how God behaves.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe you can speak to that or not.
But again, to me, that is all within the context of the ending, which is you've been thinking about this incorrectly. And again, so to me, the secular perspective of this, and again, going back to Slavoj Žižek, is the point is that you can come up with every explanation for why your life is the way that it is or why things happen to you. But the answer boils down to no much better than a bet. And then to me, that's a human. That's a human who feels good, who feels like they're truthful, who feels like they're moral, and then has had bad things happen, and then is asking those important questions that he's manifesting through the story of Job. He or she, probably he, which is essentially like, why are bad things happening to me, even though I'm doing all these things correct? And this is, to me, the manifestation of that kind of critical thinking exercise. That's where he sits down and writes Job and gets to a point where God, or that inner voice, is speaking to him and saying, you're coming up with all these explanations, but the reality is, like, it's too big for you to understand.
We never get a clear answer.
Right, and that's an important point too, because you can't get an answer because there isn't an answer really. The answer is actually that there was a bet between God and Satan, right? That's the actual answer. Why did it happen to you? Because Satan prompted God, and it was this exchange. It was this conversation between God and Satan, right? That's the explanation in the Bible.
To throw a wrench in the conversation, I read from a rabbi that one of the interpretations of Satan is that he's a prosecutor of sorts.
Yeah, he's an accuser.
Yeah, he's the accuser of the brother. That's one of the titles that he gets in the New Testament. Is that I mean, to take it for a different loop, I mean, there are people who theorize that the work of Satan himself is to almost be like a tester.
Yeah, that he's just playing a role that God gave him.
Because I mean, there's nothing that he did.
Good job in Job.
What? Yeah,
that's Mona Lisa for you, but But
yeah.
But yeah, I mean that's his actual job, and when he's done with his job, that's where
Well, there's a really good story too. Not to sidetrack too much because it's about Job, but there's a really good story by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Jorge Borges, called "The Three Judases," and I told you about that before. I think maybe I've talked to you about it before, but it's a story about a scholar who basically gets banished from the like Catholic philosophers or whatever because he makes the argument that Judas is actually Jesus. And his argument is that Judas knows about hell, right? He was born in this time. He understands that hell is a real thing, but he still chooses to put, and he also knows that Jesus is God, right? Because he spent time with Jesus. He knows what Jesus can do, but he still chose to betray Jesus because he knew he had to. I'm not saying that that's actually what it is, but that starts to turn the roles of good and evil on their head, which I tend to like, and I think can go back into the story of Job, because we tend to see all these things that happen in our life as good and evil rather than just what happens to us. You know, we want to label everything. We want to label everything as good or bad, when the reality is like, that's your perspective, right? It's your perspective that it's bad, but that has always happened to people. It's happened to good people. You know, the rain falls on the good and bad alike, right?
Your house getting burned up, a whirlwind of fire coming out of the sky and burning up all your children, or falling down. And that doesn't happen to everybody.
Yeah, I mean, he loses his entire wealth.
And
no,
all his children die. And then he falls ill, like severely ill.
I don't. I am almost certain that has happened to multiple people in history.
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure people have lost everything and been so sick that they're in a desert, they're about to die, they've lost everything.
But you said
like
it
that
happens
happens
to everyone.
Okay, right,
So,
right.
I mean, it's not necessarily.
It's not the same amount.
We all end up in tragedy, though. I mean, tragedies. I mean, none of us escape tragedy.
Yeah, and that was kind of my only point, was that bad things happen. You know, bad things happen to the good and bad. I've just butchered that.
And I mean,
verse or whatever,
even in Psalms, it talks about, you know, like, I can't remember which writer it was, but basically him looking at God and saying, why do wicked people prosper in their way? And so there's this questioning that, wait a minute, they're doing bad, I'm doing good. It's not that I'm necessarily doing extremely bad, but why are they prospering? And it's this question of, God, what are you doing here in this situation? If you want me to live this way, it even talks about in Malachi that basically the people of God at that time started looking at God like, what's the point in following you? Like, they're prospering over here, or they're doing whatever, you know, they want to do. Why should we? And God being upset with them. I can't remember what the explanation to that was. That might even be Hosea.
But the Bible does give you that impression, though. So that's the thing that to me is important, is that, like, again, his three friends are giving him these biblical explanations, but there's throughout the Bible, up to even Job, there are these instances where there seems to be a connection between your action and what happens to you. It's set up several times, whether it be the Pharaoh, right, and all the plagues that happened to them, right? Even though, again, that gets tricky too, but there seems to be some relation that you can see.
Specifically in Romans 9, he talks about Pharaoh and how God turned his heart,
right,
not to listen to him.
Yeah,
and then because I think the thing is, when what the hard part, and it's kind of going in streamlining into, it's just from the Christian perspective, where when I first was a Christian, it was me. God was like, it was almost like he was supposed to be doing what I thought he should be doing.
Mm-hmm.
And you flip it on its head, it's everything is about God, and it's about his actual plan that he's unfolding, and it talks about him building a spiritual house unto himself. And so when it goes back to it from being like, oh, well, God created us and we're supposed to be getting something that he's supposed to somehow be working for us in some way.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily that. It's more or less like we are a part of what he is building.
Yeah, we're like cogs in a wheel. We have a part to play.
Right. And see, the thing is, that can be true regardless of whether or not you kind of adopt a religious perspective on it. Is that like you are in the machinations of the universe, like you can't modify the machinations of the universe. Like you are,
what machinations is
like the happenings, like inner cog work, right?
Okay.
Like you're a part of the tapestry. You are not the full painting, right?
There's an implication of some kind of fate.
You can't change the painting.
Like there's something unfolding that, like, it's just a runaway train, and like you're part of it or you're not. But you're supposed to play your role. But I think that what you're saying, though, you're not implying fate,
No,
right? So this
not
could be an
necessarily. No.
accident of events to you.
Yeah, but it's the same. It has the same kind of like principles, though. That's the thing, is it doesn't matter if it's intentional or not intentional, because the point is that it's so complex that you can't really comprehend it anyway. Like, that's my point, I think, by the end of it.
Well, Job does a great job of making you feel small. I mean,
Yes. And a lot,
particularly when God shows up in the conversation.
And a lot of religion does that. The Bible or the Quran or the Bhagavad Gita, it's talked about a lot. That is the kind of the overarching theme, is that we are really small and insignificant, and we kind of like lose track of that. But and it's, again, you can fall into the trap, or like you can talk about the fact that, like, it might be getting this a little bit wrong, but the Jews were kind of made to wander the desert for 40 years, right? Because they started worshiping false idols, right? And that happens a lot, where it's like your actions produce the consequences. And to me, Job is a deviation from that. It's a deviation where there doesn't seem to really be that same formula of your actions dictate what happens to you in life.
Well, it depends. Yeah. I guess that's depending on what you're looking at, or whose standard of actions you're looking at, though. Mm-hmm. Because, like I said, if self-righteousness, which in the Bible is sin,
I'm not even like with Job. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but like, just real quick, because it's like, I understand how self-righteousness can be a component in it, but I also like. And I might just be wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure, like, the Bible calls Job righteous. It doesn't say he called himself righteous. Right. It says that in God's eyes he was righteous. So he is a righteous man. It's not that he's just. He might also be self-righteous.
But how is righteousness obtained?
How is righteousness obtained? You asking me personally?
No, like
according to the Bible.
According to the Bible.
Yeah.
If I had to take a shot at it, I mean, it's living in accordance with God's word, His commandments.
Yeah,
that's how you attain.
The first instance of faith was from Abraham, right? In the scriptures, where it says Abraham believed God, and it was accredited to him as righteousness. So, like, before there was a sacrifice that satisfied the wrath of God, there was belief. There was an actual belief in faith,
genuine belief. There's a genuineness to it,
and so there was a this is not something I can say definitively, because it's something I wasn't there with Job, but it seems to allude to this place that he thinks something about himself. But then there's also a part even in Romans where it says, according to God's foreknowledge, He's chosen people that he is going to conform into his image. And so there are things that God can declare from a state of his being that is actually absolutely true, but in the scheme of our timeline have not been realized yet. And so and the processes that he takes us through, and going even back to the life of Peter, there are things that Peter was doing. Is like, at one point he's saying, flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but it's the Holy Spirit revealed it. The next minute he's saying, get behind me, Satan. Mm-hmm. He says, you don't even know what spirit you're of. And so there's this proclamation, and then he says to Peter, he's like on this rock. He's not talking specifically about Peter. He's like, on this rock, the revelation of who I am, I'm going to build my church. And so there's this understanding of God's infinite understanding and his proclamation from that well of understanding that precedes the timeline that we are currently in, or we're in the story. So when he's talking about him as being righteousness, even though he is there are places of self-righteousness that, in my opinion, obviously are displayed in the fact that I'm trying to almost pay off God to not do this and not to do that. I don't understand how these things work because of what has transpired later on in the scriptures and the way that he revealed himself later on.
Well, I think we can say definitively through the book of Job that Job was righteous because at the beginning of the book, God describes him as one of the most righteous on the planet. Mm-hmm. And then at the end of the book, when God is speaking to Job, he actually points over at Job's friends and is like, "Hey, you guys are totally wrong about everything you said, and you've lost favor in my eyes, and you're only going to regain favor if Job burns offerings in your name and prays for you." Yeah. So I don't like. I think we can say that Job was righteous. I mean, maybe his logic and what was happening to him was wrong, but I mean, I'm pretty sure that we don't have to like spend time arguing on whether he's righteous or not.
Yeah, and also it's like for me, there's different standards of righteousness. Like I could probably find multiple perspectives, even in the Bible, of what righteousness is or what it entails. So it might not be. I don't know that. And also, like, if Job was here today, we might not see him as righteous. We might be like, dude, you are backwards. Like you believe you have all these traditions or values that are not what we would call good, right? So you kind of have those things too. The only thing that matters to me is that, and it can go to the self-righteousness, but whoever wrote that probably saw themselves as righteous. I think that is important to me. Or whoever, to me, people might say that Moses wrote that, right?
Yeah, some people think that.
Right. Even though like those scriptures have different like voices and patterns of writing, right?
Job is one of the oldest texts.
It is, yeah. It's like one of the first. I think it might be almost the first. So it is one of the older. But to me, it is. It's whoever wrote that. It would be hard for me to imagine that they hadn't been through something awful and seen themselves as good people. You're trying to do the right things, and that this was the kind of like the story that came of it, where it's just like, how can you see yourself as so good and right and still just be like utterly destroyed or have awful things happen to you? And then to me, that just goes back to the divorce. There's a divorce between your behavior and the things that happen to you. The things that happen to you don't necessarily reflect, but we're told that all the time. We're told, oh, these things are happening to you. Well, they're happening to everybody. Has an explanation for something. That's the other thing. Like, we can put this into today's world, modern context, right? Everybody's got an explanation for why. Oh, you don't have a car. It's because you don't work hard enough and you don't do these things. They're going to start to give you these explanations. The reality is, at least for me, this is my own perspective, you don't know. I don't know. Okay? I'm going to come up with explanations in my head. You're going to come up with explanations in your head. We're both just dumb humans.
But again, and I think maybe you guys would agree or not, we'll see here in a second, but you would still agree, though, that it's better to live like your behavior
absolutely
does affect your consequences.
That's the point. I think that's even the point of Job, too.
So Job still lived the way that he should have, regardless of,
for the most part,
what happened to him or not.
Yeah, I mean, God still seems to have some quarrel with him. Maybe it's because of the lamenting. I think God's unsatisfied because it's like, you could be doing the things that you're supposed to be doing, but instead you're trying to come up with an explanation. Like, stop trying to find the explanation. Do the next thing that you should be doing, that is right to do.
It seemed to me the only point that God was making was that you have no right to question.
Yeah.
Because of who I am. This you don't even get to ask.
Right.
And when God shows up, Job's like, and I would do the same thing if God appeared to me, because we've had conversations like this before, and I complain about the outcome of the story because I find it infuriating that for a test, God kills his children. Like, that's the most frustrating thing for me. And then the reward is supposed to be that he gets new children in the future. I'm like, well, what
What's
if you
were
loved that you loved your kids that were already with you?
Yeah.
For a test. And I find that infuriating, but
I think that another thing too is that God I lost my train of thought there. Sorry.
Well, what I was going to say was that I feel those emotions for tragedies that I've witnessed.
Yeah.
Right. But if God actually, and I've complained about those things, but if God appeared to me, I wouldn't say anything. I would do what Job did, and I'd take everything back.
Right.
But
yeah. So like the questioning thing comes, I think, from the agent perspective, where you're actually dealing with another agent, right? In my perspective, again, it can work both ways, but I guess I would phrase it as, it's not that you can't question God, it's that you can question it, but what good is it? Like, you can question the universe and what's happening, but what good is it considering how ignorant you are and how complex the universe is? Again, you're going to come up with these explanations, but the context you really have is so small, given how small you are compared to everything in the universe, compared to how much you don't know about truth and morality, you know, compared to how little those things are explored, you know. So you know, you can, that's, to me, it's not so much don't question God, it's like you can question, but you're not going to really get anywhere. Like, you're not going to get that far or whatever, which you might, you know, you can come up with some explanations for why your life is the way that it is, but the reality is, and this is where, you know, I tend to disagree with some, I don't want to get too political in this one, but the political perspectives is, you know, everything's on you or whatever. It's just like, if you don't have X, Y, and Z, it's because you didn't do X, Y, and Z. But I have seen people that are ridiculously hard workers, you know, ridiculously hard workers who never get anywhere in life. That's the truth. That is the truth. It's just like, well, why does that happen? Because it happens. Because sometimes people work really hard and still don't get anywhere. That, you know, you can come up with every explanation. Well, it's because of a rigged system, and it's just like, some of that might be true, but the reality is there is, like, it's complex. It's really complex and nuanced. And you can blame that person. You can blame the system. Maybe it's both, right? But the reality is, you can't really put your finger on it. You can pretend to. You can be the smart guy, like Job's friends are trying to do. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to be the smart people. They're trying to be the know-it-alls. They know why what's happening is happening. They want the glory that comes with having the right answer, right? And to me, I think that's where that stuff starts to come out, where they're like, where God is finally like, stop trying to find the answer. You know, like, it's bigger than that. It's bigger than that. Just do, you know, Job had a certain pattern of behavior before, and that stopped once all the things started working against him almost instantaneously. He went from living his life to lamenting almost instantly, right? And to me, I guess that was the whole point of that ending there. It's just like, stop asking the questions, you know, and not to be too like persnickety here, because people go through really difficult things. So I'm not saying like you have kids die and you can't feel bad about it, or you're going to do those things naturally. But I guess my perspective is like, that's not the point. You know, you're going to do those kind of like as a natural cycle of a human being. But I feel like things could be better if you recognize, like, oh, it's kind of like, if you want to see the universe as God, like, you're just in the presence of God again in that moment. Something bad has happened, and then you recognize, like, oh, I'm in a universe where bad things happen. That's why it happened. Like, that's as good as an explanation as you can have in the moment. And now what do I do? Well, maybe I have other kids. I go spend time with them, right? If you spend time lamenting like Job did, you're going to miss your other kids. You're going to miss those other things that you could be doing and should be doing as a truthful and decent human being. I think that pretty much... I got out. That's what I had meant to get out the whole time. But that is, you know, what really makes sense to me, because you have that a lot, right? You can imagine Job today. You can imagine Job's kid dying and them lamenting in a room. Why is this happening to me? And they have, and there's an alternate version of Job where he maybe spends some time lamenting because it's natural, but he recognizes the godly answer is, it's too big for you. It's too big for you to understand. Move on. And then he goes, spends time with his other kids, connects with them, and he actually ends up doing the godly thing in that moment, which is to move on with his life and figure out how to move forward in this thing. I think, yeah, that was why I wanted to have a conversation about this, because for me, I've had things happen to me my whole life, and I did that for most of my life, for most of it. You know,
like a why me thing.
yeah, like, why is this happening to me? Why do these things happen to good or bad people? It wasn't just about me. It was about other people too, because I see injustice everywhere. I see it
Right.
absolutely. Why are these things happening to these people who are just trying to make a better lives for themselves or whatever? Why do these, and it's just like, you can come up with all those that doesn't mean you also shouldn't do anything about it. I'm not saying that either, right? If you see injustice or whatever, but the point is, what do you do when you see injustice? Do you lament about it or do you act on it? It's just like, you're better off acting on it, not thinking about why it's happening. Like, you're going to do it naturally, but you really want to get to the action part, because the action is more so where the change comes from than the trying to come up with all the explanations, So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the right approach in terms of looking at the book of Job and how you should live your life. But for me, the reason I find the book so infuriating is because it happens. I mean, we learn all these lessons because of a bet, and that's why I find it so frustrating. Is because it shouldn't have had to happen. But I mean,
yeah, and the bet to me, the bet is a curious thing, because I think whoever wrote Job, I'm pretty sure believed in God and was a religious person, right?
Sure.
It's really curious to me that the overall reason that they give, whoever wrote Job, is that it is a bet, which boils down to randomness, right? When we think of bet, we think of random numbers, right? You don't think of actual reasons. You think it's statistics. It's it's a gamble, essentially, right? And that, to me, is like a curious kind of like little insert there. It's like it's a wash. It's a gamble.
I mean, so like when I imagine, particularly from the Christian perspective, when I was imagining what I thought God was like, I mean, there's different interpretations. Some people see God as like this all-consuming love that reaches out to all of us. But for me, when I was growing up, I viewed God from like, and I got some of his perception from Job as like this medieval king. And he had all the power, and whatever his decisions made were divine, and he kind of ruled like this very powerful medieval king. That's how I viewed him. And so Job is like, from the perspective of Job, it's just he made a decision and it's right because he made that decision. Whereas like from a philosophical perspective, it seems like an injustice to me to have a good person suffer. Yeah. Based off of that decision. So there's this weird dichotomy between, divine right and, what I might perceive as true justice. But my opinion of justice doesn't really matter if God is actually making that decision, if God exists and he determines it's right. And so that dichotomy has always frustrated me, because what I feel is right versus what he sees as right
or different things
doesn't match.
Yeah. And I think that can go into, I think there's like common ground to be made, because to me, like, there's an issue of agency where you pretend that you're acting with an actual conscious, purposeful agent.
Right.
But there's also, it could also be an issue of anthropomorphizing God, where you think that what you understand as these things are the same as what a God would understand these things to be. Right. So it can work either way. That basically, if you treat,
but if we were created in his image, I should be able to anthropomorphize.
That's a completely different
bit, right?
I know. That's why I stay within the pocket of Job here. That's why I don't go outside of it.
Yeah.
But,
all right, we can go back.
Yeah. I mean, we can go and we could get into large philosophical debates about the Bible that have happened. But to me, the story can be taken on its own. But I mean, the thing is, though, I agree with you. Yeah. Like, in terms of like actual justice, like, would it be right for a human to ever act like that?
No.
Right? It wouldn't be.
No.
At least I don't know if you would agree or disagree with that.
Like what?
If let's say that your kids, right? Let's say like your kids loved you and they worshipped you, right? Mm-hmm. And then some guy comes up, right? Or let's say a lawyer comes up or whatever and says like, hey, they wouldn't love you if you didn't give them all that stuff. Mm-hmm. And you immediately start destroying your children. You'd be like, you need to go to jail, mm-hmm. right? You'd be like, you just take away all his toys and kill all his friends. You'd be like, oh, you're a psychopath. Mm-hmm. Even though also Job doesn't say that. Job doesn't say, by the way, God does these things, mm-hmm. right? What Chris would say is that he allows it, right? But even allowing it, even if you were like, okay, I'm not going to do it, but I'm going to let the lawyer do it, you'd still be like, okay, well, you and the lawyer both need to go to jail. But that's from the human, that's the human kind of, that's if you're dealing with a human or you pretend that you're dealing with a human. And this might be a little too off track, but it might not matter whether or not God is a conscious agent, because we understand agency as something that might be completely wrong than any word I've said this before too. When you're describing God, we want to attribute consciousness to him, but we're conscious. Why does God also have to be conscious? Does God have to be conscious? Does God have to be an agent? Or is that just what we've been using?
What do you mean by conscious?
Conscious?
Yeah.
I know that's what I'm saying.
Right.
And the other thing is, where do we recognize consciousness? Well, it's in the brain.
We're talking about decision-making
it's local.
capacity, the ability to create, design, instruct what happens. And again, I mean, if we're talking about the Christian God, I mean, I would for sure argue that he's conscious. I mean, he's designed the universe. He makes decisions. I mean, he allowed Satan to do what Job did through conversation.
Right, but that is also still from human writings, though, right? Not to say that what I'm not saying here is that they were necessarily incorrect, but the point is, if you don't have the words to describe something, you're going to reach to the words that you have.
I think the Bible even echoes that. I mean, Paul in Corinthians says, he's like, hey, right now we see dimly as in a mirror. It's like we are not getting the full picture here. He says,
no, for sure, agree with that.
He says we see in part right now. He says, but when the mirror or the cloud is removed, he says, then we will fully know as we are known. But that's
probably means we're gonna die. That's just a way of saying, like, you're all gonna die, and then
you'll
kind of you'll be a part of the, like, right now we are this like local being. That's what I was saying with consciousness. Consciousness is local to us. It's in our heads, right? So it's local to us, which it gives it this like small effect. It's really small, right? So anything that God is could not be that small thing. It would have to be something else. It would have to be something else, right? And something that you didn't understand. So.
In the matter of viewing things from the lens of just a lifetime affects whether something is justified or unjustified or right and wrong. So if you expand time and our existence, us as conscious beings or living beings, from just this lifetime to a past and a future where there might be more existence ahead, what happened to Job might not feel like such a great act of injustice to me if there's more to come. I mean, I think that's the gist, because there's a part where, like, kind of into what you're saying from the secular point of view, is like there's so much that you don't understand. So, like, really trying to piece all these things together, it's like what we say to each other, to other brothers in the faith, are like, don't judge an unfinished work. Like, there's certain persons that I'll look at and I'll be like, ain't no hope for this cat. You know what I'm saying? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, he just, and the caution is it is almost me making an indictment against God's ability to save and to actually do what he says he can do. Yeah. Don't judge an unfinished work from your little minuscule perspective, right? But in the long run, it's like, what is his plan? Because if eternity is the end goal and the promise that he makes, and the end goal of what he is and the decisions that he is doing is to bring us into the image so that we could spend eternity with him. And if there is if simultaneously he's saying, this is a righteous man that I've chosen for myself, but also there are unrighteous things that are in him that I'm going to utilize, I'm going to extend my show my glory in being able to bring him to utter nothingness. Let the enemy take the best shot that he has at him, and then I'm going to restore him twofold, and bring everything back to him double, right? But then at the same time removing the self-righteousness that he didn't even realize was in his heart, that caused a mirror between the way that he viewed me. And so there's a certain place where
that turns it on its head and starts looking at you start looking at the goodness of God instead of it being there's two ways that you can see it from. And there's a place where it's like, okay, if this is the end goal and this is the way that he's doing, he knows a part of the story I can't even see and fathom at this point. If this is the case and this is the promise that he has and he allows these things to happen, there's a purpose for me. And it teaches me in the future to not to judge an unfinished work, because I don't know what's around the corner. I don't know what it's something with walking with God, me personally, that is like, okay, I don't understand why that happened. Namely, I'll be a little bit transparent with my father's situation. It's one of those things that now I look at young boys and I'm ministering to them from a perspective that uniquely I understand with them.
Right, that you wouldn't have had. Unless,
and I was, as a young boy, I'm kind of like, I mean, the way he got taken away was freaking crazy. You know what I'm saying? Like, it wasn't like he wanted to even be a deadbeat dad or not even be around. It's like these things took place, and I could try to figure all these things out. But
that's interesting too. That wording, these things took place. Like, that's what happened. Like,
right, this is what took place.
Yep.
And these are the ramifications that had on my life. But now that I look at him now, it's just like when I'm talking to a young man, he understands that I understand him.
Yeah. In
a way that I don't think other people that probably grew up with their fathers or understood those things could even touch on. And there's perspectives that I have. There's a grace that I have with those boys, and I didn't even, those things were, in my opinion, were set up by the Lord for me to walk into. Is it, like it says, the steps of a righteous man are ordered of the Lord, and he delights in the way. And so there's a delighting in the way that the Lord set out for me. And I walk into certain things and I'm just like, holy crap.
See, I consider those things more serendipity, for the kind of the secular perspective. It's like those serendipitous moments really happen. They don't have to happen, by the way. There are plenty of people that they don't experience things as impactful as that ever, and they probably won't ever in their life. So I think that's also something to consider too. But it's also like, even in my line of walk, it's like I grew up going to a really poor school district and didn't really value education at all. But I think that gave me a unique perspective after high school of like starting and being like more simple about it and more basic and getting to like the basics of education or whatever, which I feel like people don't necessarily have that advantage. And that seems like, am I supposed to be doing this? Like it's that type of thing where it's just like, is it because it feels right? Like that's the thing, is you end up, whatever. But to go off your other point really quick about something that I think a lot of people, or that we can kind of all agree on or whatever, especially when it goes into how we view other people, because we do, and it doesn't just work within the context of Job's head, because that's where we're at right now. We're in a context where he wants to understand what's happening to him. And what I'm saying is we could do the same thing with other people, where we're like, I can come up with every explanation for why your life is the way that it is, but the reality is I'm too small to know. So I'm not going to judge, right? That seems to be the thing where if you sit down and you think about it, is the actual right thing. Where it's like, I'm not, like you were saying, like you can say, well, that person's never going to get anywhere, right? But the reality is you don't know, like you have no clue. But you let it come out of your mouth anyway, right? And that's the error there, right? And I think that gets us. And the thing is, like, and that again, that's both. I'm trying to figure a way to like, kind of pull these two things together. But what I would consider people who have actually thought about it, both secular and non-secular, get to a point where they feel that way. Like my grandmother, like, she's very religious. She's Catholic. But she's still at the point where whenever she sees somebody, and she's done this my whole life, which I think kind of instilled it in me, which is again a great thing. But whenever she would talk about something that bad that happened, or somebody did something wrong or incorrect, right? She would tell me what happened in like the most plain speak you possibly could. Here's the events, but I can't say. Like that was her bottom line always. It was never to judge that person and say like, oh, well, they shouldn't have slept with this or that person or done this. Like she wasn't on that at all. And like you can see, like that's, and then you look at my grandmother, she's a very at peace person. And I feel like You can go to any religion. You can, and going back to kind of the agency thing one more time, and this is again my perspective, is the idea that in terms of being godlike, I guess for me, again going back to the idea of God having this purpose or whatever, it's more so like I feel connected with what I would call God when I am indifferent. Not in like I don't care about what happens to people, but I stop trying to explain things so much. Like I'm outside of my head now. I'm just an actor, you know? I'm just doing the thing, right? Like, and that is an attribute of human thought, is that the reason that we have to be in our head so much is because we have to ask questions we don't have answers to. We have to do this. We have to do that. We have to be in our own heads and identify with that ego. And I don't think if there was a God, that God would do that. That God would not be what you would describe as in their own head. God doesn't have to ask any questions. God would just act. God would be the thing that is, and which is what the Bible says, right?
Yeah.
So God just is. God is the actor, right? And that if you observe close enough, you stop the judgments. You stop the judgments about your own life. You stop the judgments about other people's lives. You reach an inner peace. And you start acting more. You start to get into the actions of things, and you dissolve. You go away. You are just now participating,
Well,
right?
I think, I mean, eerily, it's similar to Christianity in the sense that the prerequisite to salvation is death to self.
Yes.
It's the foundation is that I'm dead, but Christ lives in me. Galatians 2:20.
I don't think there's anything strange about it, though. Again, and this is to go back. Like, I don't have
never
anything.
said it was a strange.
No, I forget
Okay.
exactly what phrasing you used, but again, I'm not in the position anymore. You know, I used to be where I felt the need to just constantly like Christianity is bullshit type deal.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but you look at all the religions, and they have some. I'm not going to say all. That might be I bit off more than I could chew there. But with a lot of religions, it's the same with Buddhism. The idea is to break the self down. So it seems like humanity has communicated to itself, whether or not it's God in the mix or not. Or, you know, if you want to understand God as bigger thing. But the idea is that we recognize, hey, something happens when you start to break yourself down. And stop trying to be something special or this and that, right? When you try to get rid of that egocentric perspective that you have on things, that reoccurs in every religion, and that doesn't mean, to me, it doesn't have to. I guess my point is, it doesn't have to make any religion true or false. It's something to just observe that is kind of like ubiquitous, and that we can take a look at and say, like, we must be trying to say something to ourselves here, at the very least, whether or not God's in the mix or not. At the very least, we've identified this thing of getting rid of the self so much. And the thing is, again, if you meditate or you get lost in prayer, right? Getting lost in prayer, right? You get to the point where like you're just not there anymore. Like you're in something else. You're in this, like, you're in a bigger presence. You know, it's like you have died, right? It's like you've died, and you know, when you die, regardless of what happens with your mind, what will happen with your body is that you are going to be more the universe than you have ever been. Right? I mean, is that fair? You always see yourself as separate from the universe, and there's reasons for that, right? Because we're in our minds, right? But when you die, all that stops. You are no longer an individual agent. You dissolve back. Your body dissolves back into the universe. It is more the universe than it's ever been, right? You are no longer yourself in that way or form. Right. And I think that
we can tell.
And the same thing happens in meditation or prayer or with the Christ analogy. You know, you die to yourself, right? And you are reborn too. So that's something to think about as well. But I guess right now we're just focusing on the death component. And that, I guess that's everything for me with Job or with anything. It's just like you stop the explanations and then you start acting more, and you feel a lot better. You feel a lot more at peace. And you got more done in the day too. At the end of the day, you're just like, I did all this stuff. I didn't have to spend so much time in my head complaining about this or doing that. Like, you just recognize these are all constituents of the universe, and they're all bigger than you. But what can I do next? Not what can I think about next? How can I make myself more myself? Like, what can I do next? How can I contribute? This idea of, I've had a teacher say it before, and I think it's pretty good advice, but like, try to be more of a producer than a consumer. Consuming takes like the individual. Producing is about other people. Yeah, and I think that's something to kind of like, go off of too. And I think, again, the story of Job, if you read it closely enough, can get you to that point where you're being more of a producer than a consumer. So what do we do when we can, or why do we consume? Because we get in our heads, we get anxious, we get all these feelings. Well, now I want to watch Netflix, or now I want to eat, or we become these over consumers because we're focused on the self rather than the product, the bigger picture, right? That's all really interesting to me, by the way. I mean, that's really interesting that manifests in every religion. I think that is an area where we could transcend, not that people won't be religious anymore. You can be whatever religion you are, but it's like, that's a fundamental basis that we could all agree on to start with, so that way, if we
losing yourself and then finding some kind of interconnectedness
to
because
people,
of that.
exactly. Yeah. Right, to the point where you're not judging this person over here or this person. You're doing things to improve things. You're not making it about you, right, and your small insignificant self.
I mean, anytime you find isolated cultures, when you have isolated cultures but you find common universal themes throughout all of them, I think that's like a clue that this is something humanity should like tune into.
Right.
And I think you're right when you say that seems to be one of those clues that everyone needs to tap into. So I mean, I think you're on the right track. Yeah. I don't know. I might challenge what you said about indifference. I don't know that indifference is the right word. I mean, just for me, my own perspective, staying on the path in terms of like a spiritual path, to me, being indifferent was always dangerous. I had to be conscious of where I'm going and what I'm doing in order to try and find an interconnectedness or lose my, because the indifference to me results in me focusing on the self. But again, we're two different human beings. So indifference for you might be better, but
no, I think it was just because of the word. I even said when I said it,
I understood your meaning though.
Right. I think that it's not that, because like that's the other thing too, is like I've had this conversation with people and it's just like, well, how do you do things then? Like if you don't have any motive, if you're not in your head thinking about what you want, your motivations, what the future is going to be like, how do you end up doing it? And the reality is, I always did anyway. Like I've been doing things anyway. Like it's because all those things were underlying and in my core. I don't have to pay attention to them. I still want what's good for humanity. I still want to be healthy. I still want, like, these things are just gonna happen, right?
So an interesting thing to throw at you then from there. One of the aspects of Job is talking about where wisdom comes from, and one of the answers is that that comes only from God. I mean, there's another explanation, I can't remember it, but you're talking about these things being intuitive to you, and again, with Job, it's like we can't control what happens to us. There's these outside forces that affect us, whether you're doing the right thing or not. And it's just like, did you just get lucky to have that intuitive ability to have those feelings or not? It's just,
that's exactly, I think there's a what you did just right there, which is like, did you just get lucky? Like you start to come up with those explanations, whereas I'm just happy being like, I'm just happy I'm here. I'm happy I get to be at peace every day and work and not think about these things so much and let them bother me. Like if I wrap my head up in too much of why this happened to me, or did I just get lucky, or was it fate, right? I'm going to start to lose track. I'm going to start to not do the things I'm supposed to be doing again. And so to me, it's better to just, again, set those questions to the wayside and be like, yeah, maybe I did get lucky. Maybe it was divine intervention, but I still got like a job to do. Like I still got something that I need to accomplish. So like I think that's a perfect illustration of how you can do something, how something like that can happen to you, and you can start to get in your own head about it.
The questions because you've asked the questions in the past, maybe you don't wrestle with them as much anymore.
That's fair too.
But that there's a difference, because I think someone who's never asked those questions is maybe blind in a way, and you're your ability to wrestle with the questions at one point in time has allowed you to lose that aspect of yourself, and with what you're saying, grow as an individual.
Yeah.
But if you're not exposed to those questions ever, or have never had to wrestle with them, then it's almost being blind. And I don't know if that's good or not. But
I think maybe that's the hell component. Like the hell component is that you have to wrestle with those questions at some point in your life. That's usually like teen angst or whatever, is when you really get into those questions of, what are the reasons, blah, blah, blah. And teens are usually depressed. They go into that negative, kind of hellish mind state. And the obverse of that is a point where you're not asking those questions and you are just doing the things. And so I guess, and maybe that goes back to the Judas thing too, or the Satan thing. It's just like, you can always find something to blame. And I'm going to blame Satan for this, or I'm going to blame this person who did this thing to me, right? And you're always going to do that rather than saying like, oh, this is all just part of the formula. This is all part of the formula. Every bit of it is just, and the Bible even says close things to that. Like God invented both dark and light, right? Not just light, dark and light, good and evil, right? So it is that all of that is the context, not just one side of it, which is maybe where I feel like I would probably diverge with some religious people, is that I think they get lost in that. They start to just look and highlight the light, and then they get confused when they start seeing the dark because they don't recognize, like, no, both of those are part of the process. You have to have both,
So maybe we're talking about like the awareness of your circumstances is a positive thing, but also the acceptance and the ability to
Yep.
accept and not ruminate or feel like there is an act of of injustice committed upon you, or being lost in that. I mean, because the danger is being consumed by that. Whatever injustice or tragedy happened,
Yep.
if you're consumed by that, that's the end of you, and then you do end up in hell.
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly it. Yeah, and I think that the other thing to that too, man, my brain's
because we were talking when the last week when we were kind of talking about Job, we were talking about how like with Job, if you accept your circumstances, like you kind of become a hero in a way.
Mm-hmm.
But if you let that rage and injustice consume you become a villain.
Yep, that's
and
exactly
then your life
it.
is over.
There's that too, and that shows up in fiction all the time. It's that same narrative, So that's.
I mean, it doesn't just show up in fiction. I mean, it shows up in actual life.
Yeah, in human beings.
Yeah,
like
right.
everyday human beings.
And I mean, you see people that have had things that have happened to them, and some of them have like extreme grace to deal with it.
Yeah, I think all three of us in the room have towed the line before of like trying to decide, which route we're gonna go.
Yeah. And you're still gonna question. I'm sorry, I want to hear what you have to say too. But you're still gonna like I was just thinking like you might, and because I told people like make excuses. That's what I've told people before, and I think that's gonna happen naturally. I'm not working out. Right? So that somebody's not working out, maybe they're overweight, right? You start to ask those questions. Why am I overweight? What am I doing, right? Or what can I do differently? And the point is that's inevitable that you're going to do that. But I guess my point is, just to not confuse people, is that's not the point. You're going to do it, but the point is to actually get to the actions. The point is to actually go to the gym. The point is to actually diet and eat right? It's not just the explanations. You're going to do that naturally. But the good part is where you actually get to act. Sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Okay, I was going to say.
Oh, my bad, man. What were you saying? You were saying that you can see this like with people, right?
Yeah.
Like you can see.
It's not just a matter of fiction, is what you're saying.
Right, like you can see it with real people. Like,
yeah.
Like they get like wrapped up in things, right? And they start to get depressed, or they start to.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's. I mean, you can see. I know people that have had very bad things that have happened to them in their childhood. The things that I can't even identify with. Period. And I know some people that the way that that those specific things manifested in their adulthood were extremely destructive and negative, and it overtook their lives. And I know other people that are shockingly like
at peace.
Yeah, and I mean, in my perspective, they're believers, and I think that has a great deal to do with it. And even going back to what I think, even within the Christian's perspective, I think I've gone through these places of where there's intense questioning of everything that I hear or what's going on, and then there comes a point where there is what the Bible calls shalom, peace, and it is a place where it's just like, Hebrews 4 talks about it a lot, entering his rest and him being the final piece that allows you to just be like
entering his rest.
Yes, and just being like, he's in control. He's paid the price, and now my function as a believer is not. It's almost what Paul is saying. He's saying, like, stop laying the same foundation of salvation and repentance over and over again. I know some people that are stuck in that, just from a Christian perspective. I'm not talking just from the secular, that are in the same repetition of, I did this wrong, I'm going to hell, like, and that, and it's not really put it to bed that Christ is the final payment for their sins. And what it does is it focuses them so inward on themselves that the nature that they actually are trying to rid themselves of is actually growing within themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And Galatians speaks to it. It says, if you sow into the flesh, you'll of the flesh reap corruption. If you sow into the spirit, you'll reap life. And so, and really the idea that is that when you are put your final trust and really put to bed all the things through the trust that you believe that Christ says to us, there is a place where now my function is I can deal with my brother's need. I can look at if I see somebody else in need, I'm not necessarily wrapped up in all the stuff that I'm going on. And Jesus alludes to it in Matthew 6. He says the birds are taken care of. That they're not wandering, they're not starving. He says, how much more will your Father in heaven care for you if he's caring for the birds? He says, you bear my image. And so there's a place where that undertone, there's a place, I think there's a natural progression, like he was talking about, even in Christendom, where there are people that are anxious. I mean, when I first got saved, you guys knew I was pretty intense, like, to say the least, just pretty intense, like.
I was probably the same way, so.
Yeah, I mean, we're intense, zealous.
Yeah, you're young.
For the new thing, and for being.
And you want to be so significant too.
Yeah.
Right.
You want to be significant, and
change
then
the world.
Yep.
Yeah, change the world, and it was like the goals are so lofty that the person right next to you don't see, or the issue of just taking care of business right there is not the fourth thing. But
yeah, I think we're on the same page at this point.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and really, I think they're step and they're in the same ballpark altogether.
Yeah.
But I mean, lastly, 1 Corinthians 13 talks about love, and he says, he's like, if you have all these other things, if you can speak in tongues, if you can do all these different, if you can heal, if you have faith that can move mountains, he says, but you don't have love. He says it's nothing. You're just clanging cymbals. You're just saying a lot of stuff. You're spinning your wheels. And then he goes on, and I find it profound, because he says, when I was a child, I spoke as a child, I thought as a child. He says, but when I became a man, I put away childish things. And it never struck me that he was talking about love previously before that. And so the spiritual picture that he's saying is my growth is not determined on how well I can do certain things, how much I can control certain situations. It's on actually my spiritual maturity is measured in the degree that I can both receive and give love. And to me, that was just like, it threw me back. And it goes on to further in 1 John. It says, he's like, look, if you don't have love, or the person who's been made perfect in love, he's like, there's nothing in him to cause him to stumble. And now, of course, that's God word, the physical God that we believe in. It is, there's nothing in that man to actually cause him to stumble, because his priority is not selfishness. It's not he's not caught up in himself. He's actually freed from the burden of himself because his trust is in someone who's taking care of that self.
Right. Yeah. It's like feeling like you're carrying everything when the reality is like that's not your role.
Yeah.
That's exactly to the point, right? You think your role is to ask all those questions and do all those things, but the reality is that's all in something else, right? Your role is to really try to get into the habit of acting, probably in love, right? Yeah. And so I'd agree with that. I think that's pretty good. Just as a final point to just to kind of transcend the religious argument just a little bit here, is that like this is something that's observed everywhere. It's certainly, I'm sure that there are Christians that do it too, but Socrates was known for sitting out in freezing cold with no clothes on, barefoot, and just chilling. And people are like, how could he do that? And the reality is he's not. Why am I cold? What's going on? Do I deserve this? It's like that's not what it's about. Like he's not in that. He's not in that mode or mindset. Or you can have, that's why you have spiritualists or Buddhists who go, they literally don't have a bed. They're in a cave meditating for weeks. They're not around humans or anything, and they're at peace and they're happy, right? And again, it is that the breaking down of that ego.
Contentment.
Yes. Yeah. Contentment. That's the other thing too, is I don't have too much more to say about this, but like we're constantly striving for happiness, and I think that's a mistake. I think we should be striving for, and maybe striving isn't the right word, but I think really we should be satisfied with peacefulness and contentment, because I think that is possible, no matter what.
And all those other things build off of those.
Yeah, exactly.
They have a correct foundation to build off of. Because I think sometimes when we're seeking joy or happiness, those become cheap thrills that we're looking for to bring temporary. I mean, it's almost like the addict that gets on something. He's looking for something
that quick and
to alleviate those things. But someone who is at peace with who they are, what they've been created, whatever they and now the need to go and find a source for those things is not necessarily that, in my personal opinion. I can't keep going away. I can't go away from it. But you know what I'm saying? Yeah. It is Christ that animates inwardly and allows me to be at peace with the things that are going on around. But in your case, just that being at peace doesn't mean that you have to go out and do all these different types of things. But then you further enjoy the things that are happening when they are not necessary to your survival, so they are in their right place and able to be actually received the right way.
Yeah, I like what you were saying about the source. I think that's it. Is it like you do this, you get addicted to drugs or whatever. You can get addicted. That's the whole idea of addiction, right? Is you're trying to find something to lose yourself in because you haven't figured out how to do it just with yourself. Mm-hmm. Just with yourself, by yourself, to lose yourself, just being there. Job helped me with that. It helped me a lot because it's just like, I don't have to worry about that anymore. I don't have to worry about what I'm going through. I don't have to think about it if it's my fault or if it's the system, like it happened. I'm sure I'm going to act politically to try to change the system. I'm sure I'm going to act to try to change myself.
It's the system. That's why I'm changing my name to Chris X.
Do it. It's probably both, but anyway, that's my spiel on it. Anybody else?
Yeah, I think it's a good place to stop.
All right, guys. Well, hopefully you enjoyed that. We're almost at the end there. That's almost perfect. But hopefully you enjoyed that. Feel free to comment all that other stuff, and have a nice night.
Night.